The captain mocked her call sign in front of the entire squadron, but what happened just minutes later would leave him speechless and rewrite the history books of aerial combat forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind whipped across Thornfield Naval Air Station as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson. The sprawling military base stretched endlessly across the Nevada landscape, its runways cutting through the barren earth like surgical scars. Rows of FSA-18 Super Hornets sat gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the aircraft hangars, their razor-sharp wings reflecting the morning sun like polished steel blades, the acrid smell of aviation. Fuel mixed with the metallic tang of desert air, creating that unmistakable scent that every pilot knew by heart. Jet engines roared to life in the distance, their thunderous echoes bouncing off the concrete walls of the maintenance bays and control towers. Ground crews scurried between the aircraft like worker ants, their orange safety vests bright spots of color against the monotone gray of military machinery. Inside Hangar 7, the largest of the aircraft shelters at Thornfield, an unusual tension crackled through the air. Today wasn't just another training exercise or routine patrol mission. Today was the annual Squadron Elimination Challenge, a high-stakes aerial combat simulation that had been the ultimate test of pilot skill for over 3 decades. The challenge was legendary among Navy aviators, not just for its difficulty, but for the records that seemed impossible to break. The current kill record stood at 11 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single simulation run, a feat accomplished by the almost mythical commander Blade Morrison back in 1987, during the early days of advanced flight simulation technology. That record had stood untouched for 36 years, despite dozens of the Navy's most elite pilots attempting to surpass it. The number 11 had become sacred at Thornfield, whispered with reverence in pilot briefings and etched into the CHIA base's Hall of Honor with golden letters. The hangar buzzed with activity as 47 of the Navy's finest pilots gathered for the morning briefing. These weren't ordinary aviators, they were the cream of the crop, hand-selected from bases across the globe to participate in this year's challenge. Each pilot represented years of rigorous training, countless hours in both real aircraft and sophisticated simulators, and combat experience that had been tested in real-world conflicts. The concrete floor of the hangar was marked with yellow safety lines and painted directional arrows, guiding personnel around the million-dollar aircraft that dominated the space. Massive overhead cranes hung motionless from the steel rafters, capable of lifting entire jet engines with surgical precision. Tool carts and maintenance equipment were arranged in perfect military order along the walls, their surfaces polished to a mirror shine that reflected the bright LED lighting arrays mounted throughout the ceiling. Near the eastern wall of the hangar, a temporary briefing area had been established. Rows of metal folding chairs faced a large projection screen, behind which stood a podium bearing the official seal of Thornfield Naval Air Station. American flags flanked either side of the speaking area, their colors vibrant against the industrial gray backdrop of the hangar walls. The pilots themselves were an impressive sight to behold. Men and women in their late 20s to early 40s, each wearing the standard issue sage green flight suits that marked them as elite naval aviators. Their name patches displayed call signs that had been earned through years of service: Viper, Thunder, Phoenix, Raptor, Maverick, and dozens of others that spoke to their personalities, their flying styles, or memorable moments from their careers. Some of these pilots were already legends in their own right. Lieutenant Commander Jake "Hammer" Rodriguez had scored the second highest kill count in the challenge's history just 2 years prior, managing to take down 9 enemy aircraft before being eliminated. Captain Sarah "Lightning" Kim held the record for fastest completion time, blazing through the simulation in just under 14 minutes. Commander Alex Phantom Thompson was known for his uncanny ability to remain undetected by enemy radar until the moment he struck. The atmosphere in the hangar was electric with competition and camaraderie. Pilots clustered in small groups, some reviewing tactical charts on tablet computers, others engaged in the kind of good-natured trash talk that had been a part of military aviation since the Wright brothers first took to the skies. Nervous energy was palpable. Everyone knew that today's performance could make or break careers, determine future assignments, and potentially earn a place in the permanent record books of naval aviation history. Ground technicians moved efficiently between the gathered pilots, conducting final equipment checks and ensuring that every piece of gear was functioning at peak performance. The simulation systems at Thornfield were among the most advanced in the world, capable of creating combat scenarios so realistic that pilots often forgot they weren't actually flying through enemy airspace. Outside the hangar, the desert landscape stretched endlessly toward the horizon, broken only by distant mountain ranges that shimmered in the heat like mirages. The isolation of Thornfield Naval Air Station was intentional. Located far from civilian populations and prying eyes, it was the perfect place for the military's most advanced training exercises and classified operations. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the hangar floor, the final preparations were being completed. Today would be different from all the previous years. Today, someone would attempt what many considered impossible, not just breaking Commander Morrison's legendary record, but shattering it completely. The stage was set for an exhibition of aerial prowess that would be talked about for generations to come. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Among the sea of experienced aviators standing in the hangar, one figure seemed almost out of place. Lieutenant Raven Calloway stood near the back of the assembled group, her petite frame barely reaching the shoulders of the pilots around her. At just 26 years old, she was one of the youngest competitors ever selected for the Squadron Elimination Challenge, and her youth showed in subtle ways that made some of the veteran pilots exchange knowing glances. Raven's auburn hair was pulled back into a regulation military bun, not a single strand out of place despite the desert wind that had been whipping across the base all morning. Her emerald green eyes held an intensity that seemed to burn from within, constantly scanning the hangar, taking in every detail, every piece of equipment, every conversation happening around her. There was something almost predatory about the way she observed her surroundings. Like a hawk studying the terrain before a hunt, her flight suit was immaculate, pressed to perfection and bearing the standard patches of her home station, NAS, Oceana in Virginia Beach. But what drew the most attention wasn't her appearance or her obvious attention to detail. It was the call sign embroidered in bold letters across her name tape, Whisper. The call sign had followed her throughout her relatively short but remarkable career. She'd earned it during her first deployment aboard the USS Constellation, where her ability to approach enemy positions undetected had become almost supernatural. Fellow pilots swore she could make her FA-18 Super Hornet disappear from radar screens at will, slipping through enemy airspace like a ghost in the machine. Her commanding officers had initially been skeptical of the stories, but after witnessing her performance firsthand during combat operations in the South China Sea, they'd become believers. Raven's hands rested calmly at her sides, but her fingers occasionally twitched, a nervous habit she'd developed during her academy years. To most observers, she appeared completely composed, almost serene. But those who knew her well could spot the telltale signs of the electric energy that always preceded her best performances. Her breathing was controlled and measured, the kind of rhythmic pattern that comes from years of meditation and stress management training. She'd arrived at Thornfield 3 days earlier than required, spending the extra time studying the base. layout, reviewing simulation protocols, and observing the training patterns of other pilots. While her competitors had been socializing in the officers' club or relaxing in their quarters, Raven had been in the flight simulators, running scenario after scenario until the maintenance crews had to physically remove her from the cockpits. Her background was unusual for a naval aviator. Unlike many of her peers who had grown up in military families or attended prestigious service academies, Raven had come from humble beginnings in rural Montana. Her father had been a crop duster pilot who'd taught her to fly in a beaten-up Cessna 152 when she was barely tall enough to reach the rudder. The path to Thornfield had been anything but easy. Raven had fought for every opportunity, every assignment, every chance to prove herself in an environment that still struggled with gender equality. She'd graduated second in her class from the Naval Academy, earned her wings with distinction, and compiled a service record that was impressive by any standard. Yet somehow, she still felt like she was constantly having to justify her presence among the elite pilots of the Navy. Her combat experience was limited but significant. During her deployment with Strike Fighter Squadron VFA 83, she'd participated in 12 combat sorties over hostile territory, earning 2 Air Medals and a Navy Commendation Medal for her performance under fire. Her squadron mates had quickly learned that despite her quiet demeanor and small stature, Raven Calloway was absolutely fearless when it came to aerial combat. What set her apart wasn't just her technical flying skills, though those were considerable. It was her ability to think 3 moves ahead, to anticipate enemy actions before they happened, and to exploit weaknesses in defensive formations that other pilots couldn't even see. Her squadron leader had once described her tactical awareness as almost psychic, a compliment that had both thrilled and embarrassed her. Standing in the hangar at Thornfield, surrounded by some of the most accomplished pilots in the world, Raven felt the familiar mixture of excitement and nervous energy that always preceded a major challenge. She dreamed of participating in the Squadron Elimination Challenge since her academy days, studying footage of previous competitions and analyzing the techniques of legendary pilots like Commander Morrison. Her tablet computer, clutched securely in her left hand, contained dozens of tactical scenarios she'd developed during her preparation for this day. She'd spent countless hours running simulations, studying enemy aircraft specifications, and developing strategies that she hoped would give her an edge against her more experienced competitors. The other pilots seemed larger than life to her. Legends with decades of experience and kill counts that read like something from a movie script. But Raven had learned long ago that reputation and experience didn't always translate to victory. Sometimes fresh eyes and unconventional thinking could triumph over established patterns and conventional wisdom. As she stood there, absorbing the atmosphere and energy of the moment, Raven made a silent promise to herself. Today, she wouldn't just participate in the Squadron Elimination Challenge. She would make her mark on its history. The call sign Whisper was about to become much more than just a nickname. The morning briefing was about to begin when Captain Derek Titan Blackstone strode into the hangar with the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. At 42 years old, he was the senior pilot at Thornfield and the unofficial leader of the old guard, those veteran aviators who believed that aerial combat was a man's game that required years of experience to master. His massive frame filled out his flight suit like he'd been born wearing it, and the collection of patches covering his chest told the story of 2 decades of distinguished service across multiple theaters of operation. Blackstone's steel gray eyes swept across the assembled pilots with the practiced assessment of a predator evaluating potential threats. His weathered face, marked by years of high-altitude flying in desert sun, bore the kind of permanent scowl that suggested he found most things in life disappointing. The scar running from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from an emergency ejection over Iraq 15 years earlier, only added to his intimidating presence. When his gaze landed on Raven, Standing quietly among a group of more experienced pilots, something flickered across his features. It wasn't quite amusement, but it wasn't respect either. He'd heard about the young lieutenant from Oceania, of course. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit community of naval aviation, and her call sign had generated considerable discussion among the senior pilots. Some viewed her stealth capabilities with grudging admiration, while others dismissed them as overblown stories, perpetuated by a squadron eager to promote their newest member. Well, Blackstone's voice carried easily across the hangar, his Texas drawl deliberately slow and condescending. Looks like we've got ourselves a celebrity in the house. Several pilots turned to see what had caught the captain's attention, and conversations began to die down as the tension in the room became palpable. Raven felt every eye in the hangar turned toward her, but she kept her expression neutral and her posture military perfect. She'd been through this before. The testing, the challenges to her presence, the subtle and not-so-subtle attempts to make her feel unwelcome. Her father had taught her that the worst thing she could do was show weakness to bullies, and Blackstone's body language screamed bully from every angle. "I heard some interesting stories about you, Lieutenant Calloway," Blackstone continued, taking several steps closer to where she stood. His voice carried just enough volume to ensure that everyone in the hangar could hear every word. "Something about how you got that pretty little call sign of yours. Whisper, isn't it?" The way he pronounced her call sign made it sound like something delicate and fragile, completely unsuited for the brutal realities of aerial combat. A few of the pilots around Blackstone chuckled, recognizing the setup for what it was. A veteran pilot asserting dominance over a newcomer in front of an audience. "Yes, sir," Raven replied, her voice steady and professional. "That's correct." Blackstone nodded slowly, as if considering this information carefully. "You know, in my experience, pilots who need to sneak around and hide from the enemy usually do so because they can't handle a fair fight." The words hung in the air like smoke from burning fuel, acrid and impossible to ignore. Commander Lisa Vortex Chun, a respected pilot from the West Coast, shifted uncomfortably and opened her mouth as if to intervene, but Blackstone wasn't finished. He'd found his rhythm now, and like a shark that had tasted blood in the water, he pressed his attack. "I mean, don't get me wrong," he continued, his tone taking on a false friendliness that fooled no one. "I'm sure stealth has its place in modern warfare. But this is the Squadron Elimination Challenge, sweetheart. This isn't about hiding in the shadows and picking off stragglers. This is about going toe-to-toe with the best pilots in the world, and proving you belong in their company." The endearment hit its mark, drawing sharp intakes of breath from several of the female pilots in attendance. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Martinez clenched her fists at her sides, while Captain Jennifer Storm Williams took a half-step forward before thinking better of it. "Maybe they should have called you Mouse instead," Blackstone added with a cruel smile, "since you seem more comfortable scurrying around in the dark than fighting in broad daylight." The laughter that followed wasn't universal, but it was loud, enough to echo off the hangar walls. Several of the younger male pilots, eager to align themselves with the senior captain, joined in with forced enthusiasm. Others remained silent, clearly uncomfortable with the public humiliation, but unwilling to challenge Blackstone's authority. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Reaper Davidson, a decorated pilot from Edwards Air Force Base who was participating in the joint service exercise, stepped forward with a grin that revealed teeth stained by years of coffee and tobacco. "Captain's got a point, Lieutenant. In the real world, enemy pilots don't exactly line up to take turns fighting you one-on-one. They come at you hard and fast, and they don't give a damn if you're trying to be sneaky about it." "Exactly right, Colonel," Blackstone agreed, clearly pleased to have backup from another senior officer. "This challenge has been won by pilots who could look their enemies in the eye and outfly them in honest combat. Legends like Commander Morrison didn't set that record by playing hide and seek. The mention of the legendary kill record brought a murmur of agreement from several pilots. Morrison's achievement had become the gold standard of aerial combat. Simulation and invoking his name carried serious weight among the assembled aviators. "I'll tell you what, Lieutenant," Blackstone said, his voice taking on the tone of someone offering a generous concession. "Maybe you should sit this one out. Watch how the real pilots handle things. Learn something that might actually help you when you get back to flying routine patrols off the coast of Virginia." The suggestion drew more laughter, and this time it was harder and more pointed. The implication was clear. Raven didn't belong among elite pilots, and her presence was something between a joke and an insult to the tradition of the Squadron Elimination Challenge that Major Robert Crusher Thompson, a Marine Corps pilot with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for aggressive flying, decided to pile on. "Hell, maybe we should start a separate category for pilots who prefer the gentle approach. Call it the tippy-toe division or something." The crowd was warming up now, feeding off Blackstone's energy and the pack mentality that could take hold in military units when hierarchy and testosterone combined in toxic ways. Even some pilots who might have been sympathetic to Raven's position found themselves caught up in the moment, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves by defending her. Through it all, Raven stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in the parade rest position she'd learned at the Naval Academy. Her face showed no emotion, no anger, no embarrassment, just the kind of professional composure that had gotten her through every challenge she'd faced since deciding to become a pilot. But inside, her heart was racing, and she could feel the familiar fire building in her chest, the same controlled fury that had driven her to excel in every training program, every qualification course, every test that the Navy had thrown at her. They could mock her call sign, question her abilities, and try to make her feel small, but they had no idea what she was truly capable of when properly motivated. The mockery continued for several more minutes, with various pilots contributing their own witty observations about stealth tactics and the supposed limitations of pilots who relied on finesse over brute force. But eventually, the attention began to shift as other conversations resumed and the formal briefing time approached. Blackstone delivered his final shot with the precision of an experienced marksman. "Don't worry, Whisper," he said deliberately, emphasizing her call sign one more time. "When you wash out in the first 5 minutes of the simulation, nobody's going to think less of you. We all know you tried your best." The words stung because they echoed the doubt that Raven sometimes felt in her quietest moments, the fear that maybe she really didn't belong among the elite pilots of the Navy, that her success had been the result of luck and favorable circumstances, rather than genuine skill and determination. But as she watched Blackstone walk away, already turning his attention to more worthy opponents, Raven made herself a promise. In just a few hours, when the simulation began and the real flying started, she would show everyone in that hangar exactly what Whisper was capable of achieving. The massive projection screen at the front of the hangar flickered to life, displaying the official seal of the United States Navy alongside the emblem of Thornfield Naval Air Station. The conversations that had been rippling through the assembled pilots gradually died down as Admiral Catherine Nighthawk Reynolds stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding immediate respect from every person in the room. At 58 years old, Admiral Reynolds was a living legend in naval aviation circles. She'd been one of the first women to fly combat missions in the Gulf War, had commanded 3 different carrier air wings, and was rumored to be in line for promotion to Chief of Naval Operations within the next 2 years. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her piercing blue eyes seemed to catalog every face in the audience as she surveyed the assembled pilots. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily across the hangar without the need for amplification. "Welcome to the 37th Annual Squadron Elimination Challenge. For those of you who are participating for the first time, Let me explain exactly what you volunteered for. The screen behind her changed to display a complex tactical map showing simulated enemy territory, complete with surface-to-air missile sites, radar installations, and defensive fighter patrols. Red zones marked areas of heavy enemy concentration, while yellow corridors indicated potential ingress and egress routes through hostile airspace. The scenario is straightforward but unforgiving, Admiral Reynolds continued. You will be flying solo into heavily defended enemy territory with a single objective: eliminate as many hostile aircraft as possible before your own aircraft is destroyed, or you are forced to withdraw due to fuel limitations or critical damage. She clicked a remote control, and the display zoomed in on specific sections of the simulated battlefield. The enemy force consists of 64 computer-controlled aircraft of various types, from aging MiG-21s and Su-27s to cutting-edge fifth-generation fighters that match or exceed the capabilities of your own aircraft. These are not training dummies, people. The artificial intelligence controlling these aircraft has been programmed with the actual tactical doctrines and combat patterns of hostile nations around the world. A murmur ran through the assembled pilots as they absorbed this information. Many had assumed they would be facing predictable computer opponents with standard response patterns. The reality was far more challenging. The simulation runs in real time, the Admiral explained, which means you will experience actual G-forces, real weapon system malfunctions, and authentic communication interference. Your aircraft can be damaged, your weapons can jam, and your electronics can fail just as they would in actual combat. The only difference between this exercise and real warfare is that nobody dies when they get shot down. Captain Blackstone leaned back in his chair, a satisfied expression on his face. This was exactly the kind of challenge that favored experienced pilots who had faced similar conditions in actual combat. Book learning and simulator time were useful, but nothing could substitute for the split-second decision-making that came from years of flying in hostile environments. Admiral Reynolds clicked to the next slide, which displayed a sobering set of statistics. In the 36 years that this challenge has been conducted, only 12 pilots have managed to achieve double-digit kill counts. The average performance is 4.3 enemy aircraft destroyed before elimination. 60% of participants are shot down within the first 8 minutes of the simulation. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge and a warning. Even among the elite pilots gathered in the hangar, the majority would fail to meet the historical average. The Squadron elimination challenge had earned its reputation as one of the most difficult tests in military aviation for good reason. The current record, Admiral Reynolds said, her voice taking on a tone of reverence, stands at 11 confirmed kills, set by Commander William Blade Morrison in 1987. That record has stood for 36 years, despite attempts by some of the finest pilots in naval history. Commander Morrison's achievement is considered by many to be the gold standard of single-pilot, air-to-air combat performance. She paused to let the weight of that statement settle over the audience. Several pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware of the enormous pressure they would be facing once they climbed into their cockpits. Today's challenge carries additional significance, the Admiral continued, because the results will be used to select pilots for Project Valkyrie, a classified program that I am not authorized to discuss in detail. What I can tell you is that successful performance in today's simulation will open doors to opportunities that most of you have only dreamed about. The mention of a classified program sent a ripple of excitement through the hangar. Project names like Valkyrie typically indicated cutting-edge aircraft development or special operations assignments that could define a pilot's entire career. Suddenly, the stakes had risen exponentially beyond simple bragging rights and professional recognition. The selection criteria for Project Valkyrie requires a minimum kill count of 8 enemy aircraft, Admiral Reynolds announced. Pilots who achieve this threshold will receive immediate consideration for the program, regardless of their current rank or assignment status. 8 kills. The number represented a level of performance that only a handful of pilots in the challenge's history had achieved. It was a target that seemed almost insurmountable, yet tantalizing enough to drive every pilot in the room to push beyond their normal limitations. Furthermore, the Admiral added, any pilot who breaks Commander Morrison's record will receive an automatic promotion and their choice of any assignment in the naval aviation community. Additionally, their name will be permanently enshrined in the Naval Aviation Hall of Honor at the Pentagon. The potential rewards were staggering. An automatic promotion could advance a career by years, while the freedom to choose any assignment meant access to the most prestigious and sought-after positions in the Navy. The Hall of Honor represented immortality within the aviation community, a guarantee that future generations of pilots would know your name and study your achievements. But Admiral Reynolds wasn't finished outlining the stakes. There is, however, a significant risk that you must all understand. Pilots who are eliminated in the first 5 minutes of the simulation will receive a formal note in their service record indicating poor performance under pressure. This notation will remain permanent and will be considered during all future promotion boards and assignment decisions. The threat was as real as the rewards were attractive. A poor showing in the Squadron Elimination Challenge could effectively end a pilot's chances of advancement within the naval aviation community. The risk-reward calculation had just become deeply personal for every person in the room. Additionally, the Admiral continued, pilots who achieve fewer than 3 kills will be required to undergo additional training before being cleared for combat operations. This remedial training will delay deployments, postpone advancement opportunities, and may result in reassignment to non-combat roles. The silence in the hangar was now complete. Every pilot was doing mental calculations, weighing their confidence in their abilities against the potential consequences of failure. The Squadron Elimination Challenge had always been difficult, but the stakes had never been quite this high. The simulation will begin in exactly 90 minutes, Admiral Reynolds announced, checking her watch. You will fly in order of seniority, with the most junior pilots going first. Each of you will have access to the full range of weapons and electronic warfare systems available on the FA-18 Super Hornet, and you will be allowed to configure your loadout according to your personal preferences. She looked directly at Raven, who was sitting in the front row as the most junior pilot present. Lieutenant Calloway, you will be flying first. I suggest you use the remaining time to prepare yourself mentally and physically for what may be the most important 90 minutes of your naval career. All eyes in the hangar turned toward Raven, who felt the weight of dozens of stares boring into her. She was not only going to face the most challenging test of her flying career, but she would do so with the added pressure of performing first. Setting the standard for everyone who followed. Captain Blackstone's voice carried clearly across the hangar as he made a comment to the pilot sitting next to him, not bothering to lower his voice. Well, at least she won't have to worry about the pressure of following a good performance. Hard to disappoint when expectations are already rock bottom. The laughter that followed was quieter than before, but it still stung. Raven realized that in 90 minutes, she would either validate every doubt that had ever been expressed about her abilities, or she would shock the entire naval aviation community with a performance that nobody saw coming. The stakes couldn't possibly be higher. The 90-minute countdown had begun, and Raven knew that every second would count in determining whether she would triumph or become another cautionary tale whispered in ready rooms across the fleet. While most of the other pilots had dispersed to grab coffee, review basic tactical manuals, or engage in nervous conversation, Raven headed directly to the flight equipment building with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a life-saving operation. The equipment bay was a cathedral of aviation technology, its walls lined with row upon row of flight suits, helmets, survival gear, and life support equipment. The familiar smell of leather, rubber, and cleaning solvents filled her nostrils as she approached her assigned locker. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she began the ritualistic process of suiting up, each piece of equipment checked and double-checked according to procedures she had memorized years ago. First came the anti-G suit, its network of bladders and pressure lines, designed to prevent blood from pooling in her lower extremities during high-G maneuvers. She tested each connection point, ensuring that the suit would inflate properly when subjected to the crushing forces of aerial combat. The slightest malfunction could mean the difference between maintaining consciousness during a critical maneuver and blacking out at exactly the wrong moment. Her survival vest came next, loaded with emergency equipment that could mean the difference between life and death in a real combat situation. Even though today's mission was simulated, every piece of gear had to be present and functional. The realism of the Squadron Elimination Challenge extended to every detail. Emergency radio, signal flares, water purification tablets, emergency rations, and a dozen other items were methodically checked and secured in their designated pockets. As she worked through her equipment checklist, Raven's mind was simultaneously processing the tactical challenge that lay ahead. 64 enemy aircraft represented an almost overwhelming force multiplier, but she had spent countless hours studying the mathematical principles of aerial combat. The key wasn't to engage every enemy simultaneously. It was to create advantageous one-on-one situations while using terrain, altitude, and surprise to avoid being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Her helmet required special attention. The HBMD helmet-mounted display was arguably the most important piece of equipment she would carry into the simulation. The sophisticated system would project critical flight information directly onto her visor, allowing her to track multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining situational awareness of threats approaching from any direction. She tested the display systems, verified the alignment of the targeting reticle, and ensured that the night vision capabilities were functioning at peak performance. The most critical component of her preparation, however, was mental. Raven had developed a pre-flight meditation routine during her academy years, a technique that allowed her to achieve the state of focused calm that separated good pilots from exceptional ones. She found a quiet corner of the equipment bay, closed her eyes, and began the breathing exercises that would center her mind and prepare her consciousness for the extreme demands of aerial combat. In her mind, she visualized the tactical environment she would soon enter. Enemy aircraft would be operating in coordinated formations, their artificial intelligence programmed to exploit any weakness or mistake. Surface-to-air missile sites would create deadly no-fly zones that could channel her into predetermined kill boxes. Electronic warfare systems would attempt to jam her communications and disrupt her targeting systems at the most critical moments. But Raven had advantages that her detractors didn't fully understand. Her call sign Whisper wasn't just about stealth. It represented a fundamental approach to aerial combat that emphasized finesse over brute force, intelligence over aggression, and patience over recklessness. While other pilots might charge into the enemy formation with guns blazing, she would use her aircraft's sophisticated sensors to identify weak points in enemy defenses and exploit them with surgical precision. Her tablet computer contained detailed analysis of every enemy aircraft type she might encounter in the simulation. MiG-21s were fast but limited by primitive avionics and short-range weapons. Su-27s possessed impressive maneuverability but were vulnerable to beyond visual range attacks. The newest enemy fighters would be her most dangerous opponents, equipped with advanced radar systems and long-range missiles that could engage her before she even knew they were there. Raven had spent the previous 3 days developing a comprehensive engagement strategy based on energy management principles. Rather than trying to outfight every enemy aircraft individually, She would use altitude and speed advantages to dictate the terms of each engagement. High-altitude attacks would allow her to maintain energy advantages, while careful ammunition management would ensure that she never found herself defenseless in the middle of a furious dogfight. The weapons loadout selection was crucial to her strategy. Most pilots would probably choose maximum missile capacity, loading their aircraft with as many air-to-air missiles as possible. But Raven had chosen a more balanced approach. Fewer long-range missiles, but a full ammunition load for her 20mm cannon. Her analysis of historical squadron elimination challenge data had revealed that pilots who relied exclusively on missiles often found themselves helpless once their weapons were expended, while pilots who retained cannon ammunition could continue fighting even after their missile magazines were empty. Her flight plan was unconventional but mathematically sound. Instead of penetrating directly into the heart of enemy territory, she would execute a series of high-speed slashing attacks from multiple directions, never remaining in any engagement zone long enough for enemy forces to coordinate an effective response. Each attack would target isolated enemy aircraft or small formations that had become separated from their main force. The psychological preparation was equally important. Raven knew that every pilot in the hangar expected her to fail spectacularly, and she had to transform that expectation into motivation rather than allowing it to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The memory of Captain Blackstone's mocking comments served as fuel for the controlled anger that would drive her performance to superhuman levels. She reviewed her emergency procedures one final time, running through scenarios that could force her to abort the mission or attempt emergency recovery procedures. Equipment failures, fuel leaks, hydraulic malfunctions, and weapons system casualties were all possibilities that could end her simulation prematurely. But for each potential problem, she had developed contingency plans that would allow her to continue fighting even with degraded aircraft systems. As the final minutes of preparation time ticked away, Raven felt the familiar transformation that occurred before every major flight. The nervous energy and social anxiety that had plagued her during the morning briefing began to fade, replaced by the ice-cold focus that made her one of the most effective combat pilots in the Navy. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate decreased, and her mind achieved the crystalline clarity that would be essential for the challenge ahead. The equipment bay began to fill with other pilots preparing for their own flights, but Raven barely noticed their presence. She was already mentally in the cockpit, already flying through the tactical scenarios that would soon become reality. Her hands moved through imaginary control sequences, her eyes tracked invisible targets, and her mind processed engagement geometries with computer-like precision. When the 30-minute warning announcement echoed through the building, Raven was ready. Her equipment was perfect, her tactics were sound, and her mental state was exactly where it needed to be. She had done everything possible to prepare for the most important flight of her naval career. Now all that remained was to prove that Whisper was more than just a call sign. It was a promise of what was about to unfold in the skies above. Thornfield Naval Air Station. The walk from the equipment bay to the flight line felt both endless and instantaneous, as if time itself had become distorted by the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Raven's boots clicked rhythmically against the polished concrete as she made her way through the corridors of Thornfield's main operations building, her helmet tucked securely under her left arm while her right hand gripped the handle of her flight bag containing her kneeboard, approach plates, and emergency checklists. The desert sun had climbed higher during her preparation time, and heat waves were already beginning to shimmer off the tarmac as she emerged from the air-conditioned building into the stark Nevada morning. The temperature difference hit her like a physical blow. The dry desert air seemed to suck moisture from her lungs, while the brilliant sunlight forced her to squint despite her tinted visor. Aircraft 307, her assigned FA-18E Super Hornet, sat on the ramp like a metallic predator waiting to be unleashed. The twin-engine fighter gleamed under the harsh desert sun, its gray paint scheme broken only by the distinctive markings of Thornfield Naval Air Station and the number 307 painted in bold black numerals on its nose and wings. Ground crew members swarmed around the aircraft like worker bees, conducting final pre-flight inspections and systems checks with the methodical precision that separated naval aviation from civilian flying. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, the senior maintenance technician assigned to Aircraft 307, approached Raven with a clipboard thick with maintenance records and system status reports. His weathered face showed the kind of deep satisfaction that came from working on perfectly maintained equipment, and his confident demeanor immediately put Raven at ease about the mechanical reliability of her aircraft. "Lieutenant Calloway," he said, extending the clipboard for her signature, "your bird is absolutely perfect this morning. We've completed full systems checks on everything from the engines to the ejection seat, and I'm happy to report zero discrepancies. Fuel load is exactly as requested. Full internal tanks plus 2 external drop tanks for maximum range and endurance." Raven reviewed the maintenance logs with the thoroughness that had been drilled into her during flight school. Engine compression readings, hydraulic pressure levels, electrical system voltages, and dozens of other critical parameters were all within normal operating ranges. The aircraft had been configured exactly according to her specifications. 4 AIM-12 or AMRAAM missiles for beyond visual range engagements, 2 AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles for close-range combat, and a full load of 412 rounds for the M61, a 2 Vulcan cannon. "Chief Rodriguez," she said, signing her name with a flourish, "this is exactly what I needed. Thank you for taking such good care of my aircraft." The maintenance chief beamed with professional pride. "Ma'am, I've been working on Navy fighters for 23 years, and I've never sent a pilot into combat, even simulated combat, with anything less than a perfect aircraft. You concentrate on flying and let me worry about keeping the mechanical systems running." As Raven began her external pre-flight inspection, she became aware of a growing crowd of observers gathering along the flight line. Word had spread quickly through the base that the Squadron Elimination Challenge was beginning, and off-duty personnel were positioning themselves to watch the proceedings. Some carried folding chairs and coolers as if they were settling in for an extended show. Others stood in small groups, pointing at her aircraft and engaging in animated discussions about what they expected to see. The external inspection revealed an aircraft in pristine condition. The twin F414G E400 engines showed no signs of oil leaks or foreign object damage. Control surfaces moved smoothly through their full range of motion when activated from the cockpit. Landing gear struts were properly serviced and showed no signs of hydraulic leaks. Weapons pylons were securely mounted and properly configured for the missile loadout she had selected. But as Raven worked her way around the aircraft, checking every access panel and inspection point, she became increasingly aware of the conversations taking place among the gathered spectators. The comments weren't particularly loud, but they carried clearly in the thin desert air, and it was obvious that many of the observers expected to witness a spectacular failure rather than a successful mission. "I give her maybe 10 minutes before she gets herself shot down," one voice commented from the crowd of maintenance personnel who had gathered near the hangar entrance. "10 minutes?" Another voice replied with obvious skepticism. "I'm thinking more like 5. These computer-controlled enemy aircraft don't mess around, and she's going up against some seriously advanced AI programming." A third voice, belonging to someone who sounded like a senior NCO, added his assessment. "The record hasn't been broken in 36 years for a reason. It takes more than book learning and simulator time to achieve that kind of performance. You need real combat experience and the kind of instincts that only come from years of flying in hostile environments." Captain Blackstone's voice carried easily across the flight line as he addressed a group of fellow pilots who had gathered to watch the opening act of the challenge. "This should be educational for everyone," he announced with obvious satisfaction. Sometimes the best way to learn about aerial combat is to watch someone make all the classic mistakes. Pay attention to what happens when overconfidence meets reality. The comments stung, but Raven had learned long ago to transform criticism into motivation. Every doubt expressed about her abilities, every prediction of failure, every suggestion that she didn't belong among elite pilots, all of it became fuel for the controlled fire that burned within her when she flew. She completed her preflight inspection and approached the crew chief ladder that would take her up to the cockpit. The familiar ritual of climbing into an FA-18 cockpit had always been a moment of transformation for Raven, the point where she stopped being a person subject to doubt and criticism and became something far more dangerous and capable. The cockpit welcomed her like an old friend. Every switch, every display, every control surface was exactly where muscle memory expected it to be. She began the intricate dance of aircraft startup procedures, her hands moving across switches and controls with the fluid precision of a concert pianist performing a complex sonata. Engine start was flawless. Both F414 engines spooled up smoothly, their distinctive whine building to a powerful roar that announced to everyone within miles that serious business was about to begin. Hydraulic systems came online with satisfying precision. Control surfaces responded properly to input commands, and navigation systems aligned themselves with GPS satellites orbiting high overhead. As she ran through her final systems checks, Raven caught sight of Admiral Reynolds observing from the control tower, her expression unreadable behind reflective sunglasses. The Admiral's presence added weight to an already significant moment. This wasn't just about personal vindication or breaking records, but about proving that unconventional approaches to aerial combat could succeed even when traditional wisdom suggested otherwise. The tower frequency crackled to life in her headset as the air traffic controller prepared to clear her for takeoff. Whisper 01, Thornfield Tower, you are cleared to taxi to runway 09 for immediate departure. Winds are 080 at 12 knots. Altimeter 30.15. Contact departure control on 327.4 after takeoff for vectors to the combat area. This was it, the point of no return. Once she released the brakes and began taxiing toward the runway, there would be no opportunity to reconsider, no chance to second-guess her preparations, no way to avoid the test that would define her naval aviation career. In less than 30 minutes, she would either validate every hour of training and preparation she had invested in this moment, or she would become another statistical failure in the long history of the squadron elimination. Challenge. Thornfield Tower, Whisper 01, cleared to taxi, she replied, her voice steady and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. As aircraft 307 began rolling toward the runway, Raven felt the familiar sensation of crossing a threshold from which there was no return. Behind her lay months of preparation, years of training, and a lifetime of dreams about proving herself among the elite pilots of naval aviation. Ahead lay 64 computer-controlled enemy aircraft, a 36-year-old record that many considered unbreakable, and the most important 90 minutes of her professional life. The FA-180 Super Hornet accelerated down runway 9 with the raw power of 40,000 pounds of thrust, pushing Raven back into her ejection seat. The desert landscape blurred past her canopy as aircraft 307 reached rotation speed, and she pulled back gently on the stick to lift the fighter into the crystalline Nevada sky. The sensation of leaving Earth behind always filled her with a profound sense of freedom, but today that feeling was tempered by the knowledge of what awaited her in the simulated combat zone. Whisper 01, contact departure, control 327.4, good hunting. The tower controller's voice crackled through her headset. The professional tone, unable to completely mask what sounded like genuine concern for her welfare. Thornfield Tower, Whisper 01 switching to departure. Thank you. Raven replied as she changed radio frequencies and began climbing toward her assigned altitude of 35,000 feet. The departure controller's voice was crisp and businesslike. When she checked in, Whisper 01, Thornfield departure, radar contact. Proceed direct to checkpoint Alpha. Maintain flight level 350. Be advised that simulation boundaries are now active. You are cleared to engage hostile targets upon crossing the boundary at checkpoint Alpha. Combat area extends from coordinates north 37 to 15 to north 37 to 45, and from west 115 to 30 to west 11600. Simulated surface-to-air missile sites are active within the combat zone. Raven acknowledged the clearance while her mind processed the tactical implications of the boundary coordinates. The combat area covered approximately 900 square nautical miles of rugged desert terrain, complete with mountain ranges, valleys, and canyon systems that could provide both opportunities and threats for a single fighter operating against overwhelming odds. The artificial intelligence controlling the enemy forces would use every geographic feature to maximum advantage, creating ambush positions and forcing her into disadvantageous engagement geometries whenever possible. Her heads-up display began painting a detailed picture of the tactical environment as her aircraft's sophisticated radar systems came online. The PG-79 AESA radar was arguably the most advanced airborne sensor in the world, capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining electronic stealth characteristics that made counter-detection extremely difficult. But even the most advanced technology would be severely challenged by the sheer number of threats she was about to face. As Aircraft 307 approached checkpoint Alpha, Raven's tactical display began populating with contact symbology that made her breath catch in her throat. The enemy force wasn't randomly distributed throughout the combat area. It was organized into a sophisticated defensive network that demonstrated the advanced artificial intelligence programming that Admiral Reynolds had warned them about. 8 MiG-21 fishbeds were positioned in a high-altitude combat air patrol at 40,000 feet, their older radar systems providing early warning coverage for the entire combat area. Below them, 4 flights of Su-27 flankers were distributed in a layered defense that would force any attacking aircraft to fight through multiple engagement zones. Most dangerous of all, 2 flights of advanced Su-35 S-flanker E-fighters were positioned as a rapid reaction force, ready to respond to any breakthrough attempts with their sophisticated radar systems and long-range R-77 missiles. The ground-based threats were equally intimidating. Sa-21 Growler surface-to-air missile systems created overlapping no-fly zones throughout the combat area, their engagement envelopes reaching up to 120,000 feet altitude and extending out to 250 nautical miles range. Sa-15 Gauntlet short-range systems provided point defense for critical areas, while older Sa-6 gainful sites created additional barriers that would channel attacking aircraft into predetermined kill zones. But what made the scenario truly diabolical was the integration between air and ground threats. The artificial intelligence wasn't operating each system independently. It was coordinating all 64 enemy aircraft and multiple surface-to-air missile sites as a unified defensive network. Every move Raven made would be instantly communicated to all other elements of the enemy force, allowing them to respond with coordinated tactics that would overwhelm most single aircraft attacks. Her mission computer chimed softly as it finished analyzing the threat environment and presented her with a tactical assessment that was sobering in its implications. Enemy aircraft were distributed across altitude bands from sea level to 50,000 feet, ensuring that she couldn't simply climb above the threat envelope and attack from sanctuary. The artificial intelligence had positioned its forces to create interlocking fields of fire that would make any direct approach suicidal. The historical data was equally discouraging. Of the 36 pilots who had attempted this challenge over the years, only 12 had managed to achieve double-digit kill counts, and most of those successes had occurred during the early years when the artificial intelligence programming was less sophisticated. Recent attempts had been even less successful. The last pilot to achieve more than 7 kills had been Captain Vortex Chin 3 years ago, and her performance of 9 enemy aircraft destroyed had been considered exceptional. Commander Morrison's record of 11 kills had been achieved against a significantly less capable enemy force, using tactics that would be completely ineffective against the current threat environment. The artificial intelligence had been continuously upgraded over the years, incorporating lessons learned from real-world conflicts and advances in enemy aircraft capabilities. What had once been a challenging but achievable goal had evolved into something that many experts considered mathematically impossible for a single pilot to accomplish. Raven's approach to the problem was fundamentally different from her predecessors. Rather than attempting to penetrate directly into the heart of enemy territory and engage multiple targets in sustained combat, she planned to execute a series of high-speed hit-and-run attacks from multiple vectors, never remaining in any engagement zone long enough for the enemy force to coordinate an effective response. Her first target would be the high-altitude MiG-21 patrol, whose primitive radar systems made them vulnerable to beyond visual range attacks from modern AMRAAM missiles. By eliminating the early warning aircraft first, she could create temporary gaps in enemy surveillance coverage that would allow her to reposition for subsequent attacks without being tracked continuously. The key to success would be energy management and ammunition conservation. Each engagement had to be planned and executed with surgical precision, achieving maximum enemy casualties while expending minimum ordnance and fuel. She couldn't afford to waste missiles on low-probability shots or engage in prolonged dogfights. That would drain her aircraft's energy reserves. As she crossed Checkpoint Alpha and officially entered the combat zone, Raven's threat warning systems immediately came alive with the distinctive tones that indicated multiple enemy radar systems were attempting to acquire targeting solutions on her aircraft. The SA-21 sights were painting her with continuous wave illumination, while the high-altitude MiG-21s were beginning to turn toward her, positioned with obvious hostile intent. The simulation had officially begun, and 64 enemy aircraft were now committed to destroying her before she could achieve even a fraction of the kill count necessary to break Commander Morrison's record. The artificial intelligence controlling the enemy force had access to her aircraft's performance parameters, weapons loadout, and fuel state. It knew exactly what she was capable of, and it would use that knowledge to create tactical situations designed to exploit any weakness or hesitation on her part. In the control room at Thornfield, dozens of technicians and observers were monitoring her progress through sophisticated computer displays that tracked every aspect of her performance in real time. Admiral Reynolds sat in the front row, her expression unreadable as she watched the opening moves of what would either be a spectacular success or a devastating failure. The countdown timer on the main display showed 89 minutes and 23 seconds remaining in the simulation. The enemy force was fully activated and beginning to coordinate its response to her presence in the combat zone. Everything Raven had trained for, everything she had sacrificed to achieve, everything she had endured to reach this moment, it all came down to the next hour and a half of flying that would determine whether Whisper would become a legend or a cautionary tale in the annals of naval aviation history. The first 30 seconds of combat would determine everything. Raven's aircraft screamed across the desert sky at Mach 1.6. Her radar locked onto the lead MiG-21 in the high-altitude patrol, while her threat warning receiver painted an increasingly desperate picture of multiple enemy systems attempting to establish firing solutions on her position. The ancient fishbed fighters were turning to intercept, but their Cold War-era electronics were no match for the stealth, characteristics and beyond visual range capabilities of her Super Hornet. "Fox 3, she called out, announcing the launch of her first IM-12 RAM missile as the weapon separated cleanly from its pylon and accelerated toward the unsuspecting MiG-21. The missile's active radar seeker acquired the target at maximum range, and the enemy pilot never knew what hit him. The first kill appeared on her tactical display as a satisfying red X, followed immediately by frantic radio chatter from the remaining MiG-21s as they realized they were under attack. But Raven was already positioning for her second shot. Banking hard left while climbing to 42,000 feet, she maneuvered to achieve an optimal firing position on the second MiG-21, while simultaneously avoiding the search patterns of the SA-21 surface-to-air missile systems below. Her energy management was flawless, every turn calculated to maintain maximum kinetic energy while denying the enemy aircraft any opportunity to achieve a missile lock of their own. "Fox 3, she announced again, sending the second AMRAAM toward its target. This missile's flight path took it directly through a gap in the enemy's radar coverage that she had identified during her pre-flight analysis, and the MiG-21 pilot had no warning before his aircraft disappeared in a simulated explosion. 2 kills in 43 seconds. She was already ahead of the historical average for the entire simulation. The enemy artificial intelligence responded with frightening efficiency. The remaining 6 MiG-21s immediately dispersed to complicate her targeting, while the Su-27 flankers below began climbing rapidly to engage her at altitude. Most dangerous of all, the Su-35's Rapid Reaction Force was vectoring toward her position at maximum speed. Their advanced radar systems, already painting her aircraft despite her attempts to maintain electronic stealth, Raven's tactical computer painted a terrifying picture of converging threats. 12 enemy aircraft were now committed to her destruction, approaching from multiple vectors with overlapping missile engagement zones that would make survival increasingly difficult. Traditional fighter tactics would call for immediate defensive maneuvering and an attempt to escape the developing furball. But Raven had no intention of following conventional wisdom. Instead, she dove hard. The Super Hornet's nose pitched down 20 degrees as she pushed the throttles to military power and accelerated toward the desert floor at a velocity that would have shattered every bone in her body if the simulation's safety protocols hadn't been engaged. Her altimeter unwound rapidly, 38,000 feet, 35,000, 30,000, as she plummeted through the middle altitude bands where the Su-27 flankers had expected to intercept her. The enemy aircraft were caught completely off guard by her unconventional tactics. Their intercept calculations had been based on the assumption that she would maintain altitude and attempt to engage them in traditional beyond visual range combat. Instead, she was diving directly into the heart of their defensive formation at a closure rate that made accurate missile shots nearly impossible. At 22,000 feet, she pulled out of the dive with a maneuver that subjected her to over 7 Gs of force, her anti-G suit inflating automatically to prevent blood from pooling in her extremities. The closest Su-27 was less than 5 miles away and completely vulnerable, its pilot struggling to adjust his intercept course to match her unexpected altitude change. "Fox 3, she called out, firing her third AMRAAM at point-blank range. The missile barely had time to arm before it had impacted the flanker, adding a third red X to her growing tally. But she wasn't finished with the low-altitude flankers. Banking hard right while pulling maximum Gs, she maneuvered behind a second Su-27 that was attempting to reverse course and re-engage. The enemy pilot was skilled, but he was fighting according to program parameters that couldn't match the intuitive creativity of human tactical thinking. Raven had anticipated his defensive maneuver and positioned herself to exploit the weakness inherent in any artificial intelligence system, the inability to think outside predetermined algorithms. Fox 2, she announced, launching in a IM-9X Sidewinder at the turning flanker. The missile's infrared seeker locked onto the Su-27's engine exhaust and guided itself to impact with devastating accuracy. 4 kills in less than 3 minutes. She had already exceeded the performance of 60% of the pilots who had attempted this challenge, but the enemy artificial intelligence was learning and adapting. The remaining Su-27s had recognized the threat she represented and were coordinating their attacks to deny her the maneuvering room necessary for continued success. More critically, the Su-35's Rapid Reaction Force was approaching her position with advanced R-77 missiles already in flight. Raven's threat warning receiver erupted in a cacophony of tones, indicating multiple missile launches from various directions. 6 R-77 missiles were inbound, their active radar seekers painting her aircraft with targeting illumination that meant certain death if she remained in her current position. The enemy had finally managed to coordinate their attacks effectively, creating a missile engagement zone from which escape seemed mathematically impossible. This was the moment that separated exceptional pilots from good ones, rather than panic or attempt defensive maneuvers that would only delay the inevitable. Raven executed a tactical gambit that defied every principle of conventional air combat doctrine. She turned directly toward the largest concentration of incoming missiles, while simultaneously dropping to 200 feet above the desert floor. Below altitude, maneuvering put her below the engagement envelope of the SA-21 surface-to-air missile systems, whose sophisticated radars couldn't track targets flying in the ground clutter at such extreme low altitude. More importantly, it forced the incoming R-77 missiles to navigate terrain following profiles that their guidance systems weren't optimized for, causing 3 of them to lose lock and impact harmlessly into the desert sand. The remaining 3 missiles continued their pursuit, but Raven had gained precious seconds to implement the most audacious part of her tactical plan. Flying at 480 knots just above the desert floor, she guided her aircraft into a narrow canyon that appeared on her moving map display, a geographic feature that would provide temporary sanctuary from the remaining threats while positioning her for a devastating counterattack. The canyon walls flashed past her canopy in a blur of red, sandstone and shadow as she navigated the treacherous terrain at speeds that would have been suicidal for any pilot with less than perfect situational awareness. Behind her, the final 3 R-77 missiles attempted to follow her flight path, but succumbed to the terrain masking and crashed harmlessly into the canyon walls. She had survived the coordinated missile attack, but more importantly, she had maneuvered the enemy aircraft into positions where they couldn't provide mutual support. The Su-35's fighters were now separated into individual targets, each vulnerable to the kind of one-on-one engagement where her superior training and aircraft capabilities would provide decisive advantages, pulling up sharply from the canyon floor. Raven climbed back to medium altitude where the next phase of her attack could begin. Her ammunition state remained excellent. She had expended only 4 missiles while achieving 4 confirmed kills, leaving her with sufficient ordnance for sustained combat operations. The tactical display showed 58 enemy aircraft remaining in the simulation, but her unconventional approach had disrupted their defensive coordination and created opportunities for continued success. The artificial intelligence was struggling to adapt to tactics that violated every assumption built into its programming parameters. In the control room at Thornfield, absolute silence had fallen among the observers. Admiral Reynolds leaned forward. In her chair, her typically composed expression replaced by one of growing amazement as she watched Raven's performance unfold. Captain Blackstone stood motionless beside his chair, his earlier confidence replaced by dawning realization that he was witnessing something unprecedented in the 36-year history of the Squadron Elimination Challenge. The mission timer showed 73 minutes remaining. Raven had achieved 4 kills in 17 minutes, while surviving a coordinated attack that should have ended her simulation. She was not only on pace to break Commander Morrison's record, she was positioned to shatter it completely. In the control room at Thornfield Naval Air Station, the silence was so complete that the soft humming of computer cooling fans seemed deafeningly loud. 67 pairs of eyes stared at the main tactical display, where 4 red X symbols marked the positions of destroyed enemy aircraft, while a single blue diamond representing Raven's Super Hornet continued to maneuver through the simulated combat zone with deadly precision. Admiral Reynolds had risen from her chair without realizing it, her hands gripping the back of the seat in front of her as she watched the tactical situation unfold in real time. In 28 years of naval aviation experience, including her own legendary performance in the Gulf War, she had never witnessed aerial combat tactics like what Lieutenant Calloway was demonstrating. The young pilot wasn't just fighting the enemy artificial intelligence. She was systematically dismantling its tactical assumptions and exploiting weaknesses that the programmers had never anticipated. "Jesus Christ," whispered Commander Hayes, the senior simulation technician responsible for monitoring system performance. His voice was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the control room, every word carried clearly to the assembled observers. She just survived a coordinated 6-missile attack that should have been mathematically impossible to defeat. The data streaming across his workstation told a story that challenged everything he thought he knew about single-pilot air combat capabilities. Raven's aircraft was pulling G-forces that pushed the absolute limits of human endurance while maintaining targeting accuracy that exceeded the performance parameters of pilots with decades more experience. Her ammunition expenditure rate was phenomenally efficient. 4 kills achieved with 4 missiles, a 100% hit rate that suggested either incredible luck or skill levels that bordered on the supernatural. Captain Blackstone stood frozen beside his chair, his weathered face pale beneath his desert tan. The confident smirk that had defined his expression throughout the morning briefing had vanished completely, replaced by the stunned realization that his assumptions about Lieutenant Calloway had been catastrophically wrong. The young pilot he had dismissed as mouse was demonstrating aerial combat prowess that surpassed anything he had achieved in 20 years of flying. "This isn't possible," he muttered to Major Thompson, who was standing nearby with his mouth hanging open in undisguised shock. "The AI is programmed with combat data from every major conflict since the Gulf War. It knows every tactical doctrine, every engagement pattern, every defensive maneuver that's ever been successfully employed in air-to-air combat." "Apparently it doesn't know everything," Thompson replied, his voice filled with growing respect for what they were witnessing. "Look at her maneuvering patterns. She's not flying by any textbook I've ever seen. She's making this up as she goes along, and somehow it's working better than 3 decades of established fighter tactics." The tactical display updated again as Raven's aircraft emerged from the canyon system and climbed back to medium altitude, positioning herself for what appeared to be another impossible attack against overwhelming odds. The remaining enemy aircraft were attempting to re-establish their defensive coordination, but their artificial intelligence programming was struggling to adapt to tactics that violated every assumption built into their behavioral algorithms. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, the Air Force exchange pilot who had participated in the morning's mockery, was studying the performance data with the expression of someone witnessing a religious miracle. "Her energy management is absolutely perfect," he said, speaking to no one in particular. "Every turn, every climb, every dive, she's maintaining kinetic energy levels that most pilots would burn off in the first 30 seconds of combat." Dr. Sarah Chun, the civilian aerospace engineer responsible for programming the enemy artificial intelligence, was frantically typing commands into her workstation while reviewing diagnostic data that made no sense, according to her understanding of combat simulation parameters. "The AI is operating exactly as designed," she announced to the room. "All systems are functioning normally. All behavioral algorithms are executing properly. Lieutenant Calloway isn't defeating the system through any kind of malfunction or programming." "Error? Then how is she doing it?" Admiral Reynolds asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting immediate answers to difficult questions. Dr. Chun paused in her typing and looked up from her displays with an expression of professional bewilderment. "Ma'am, she's thinking faster than the artificial intelligence can adapt. The AI learns and adjusts its tactics based on observed pilot behavior, but it requires a certain amount of time to process new information and modify its responses accordingly. Lieutenant Calloway is changing her tactical approach so rapidly that the system can't keep up with her innovations." The explanation hung in the air like smoke from burning aviation fuel, acrid and impossible to ignore. Every person in the control room understood the implications of what Dr. Ching was suggesting, that a 26-year-old pilot with limited combat experience was outthinking computer systems that had been programmed with the collective knowledge of military aviation's greatest tactical minds. Commander Rodriguez, the base operations officer, was studying the timeline display with growing amazement. "She's achieved 4 kills in 17 minutes, while surviving attacks that have eliminated every other pilot who's attempted this challenge in the past 5 years. At this rate of performance, she's not just going to break Commander Morrison's record, she's going to obliterate it." The mathematical reality with the data streaming across his workstation told a story that challenged everything he thought he knew about single-pilot air combat capabilities. Raven's aircraft was pulling G-forces that pushed the absolute limits of human endurance while maintaining targeting accuracy that exceeded the performance parameters of pilots with decades more experience. Her ammunition expenditure rate was phenomenally efficient. 4 kills achieved with 4 missiles, a 100% hit rate that suggested either incredible luck or skill levels that bordered on the supernatural. Captain Blackstone stood frozen beside his chair, his weathered face pale beneath his desert tan. The confident smirk that had defined his expression throughout the morning briefing had vanished completely, replaced by the stunned realization that his assumptions about Lieutenant Calloway had been catastrophically wrong. The young pilot he had dismissed as Mouse was demonstrating aerial combat prowess that surpassed anything he had achieved in 20 years of flying. "This isn't possible," he muttered to Major Thompson, who was standing nearby with his mouth hanging open in undisguised shock. "The AI is programmed with combat data from every major conflict since the Gulf War. It knows every tactical doctrine, every engagement pattern, every defensive maneuver that's ever been successfully employed in air-to-air combat." "Apparently it doesn't know everything," Thompson replied, his voice filled with growing respect for what they were witnessing. "Look at her maneuvering patterns. She's not flying by any textbook I've ever seen. She's making this up as she goes along, and somehow it's working better than 3 decades of established fighter tactics." The tactical display updated again as Raven's aircraft emerged from the canyon system and climbed back to medium altitude, positioning herself for what appeared to be another impossible attack against overwhelming odds. The remaining enemy aircraft were attempting to re-establish their defensive coordination, but their artificial intelligence programming was struggling to adapt to tactics that violated every assumption built into their behavioral algorithms. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, the Air Force exchange pilot who had participated in the morning's mockery, was studying the performance data with the expression of someone witnessing a religious miracle. "Her energy management is absolutely perfect," he said, speaking to no one in particular. "Every turn, every climb, every dive, she's maintaining kinetic energy levels that most pilots would burn off in the first 30 seconds of combat. Dr. Sarah Chun, the civilian aerospace engineer responsible for programming the enemy artificial intelligence, was frantically typing commands into her workstation while reviewing diagnostic data that made no sense, according to her understanding of combat simulation parameters. "The AI is operating exactly as designed," she announced to the room. "All systems are functioning normally. All behavioral algorithms are executing properly. Lieutenant Calloway isn't defeating the system through any kind of malfunction or programming error. Then how is she doing it?" Admiral Reynolds asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting immediate answers to difficult questions. Dr. Chun paused in her typing and looked up from her displays with an expression of professional bewilderment. "Ma'am, she's thinking faster than the artificial intelligence can adapt. The AI learns and adjusts its tactics based on observed pilot behavior, but it requires a certain amount of time to process new information and modify its responses accordingly. Lieutenant Calloway is changing her tactical approach so rapidly that the system can't keep up with her innovations." The explanation hung in the air like smoke from burning aviation fuel, acrid and impossible to ignore. Every person in the control room understood the implications of what Dr. Chun was suggesting, that a 26-year-old pilot with limited combat experience was outthinking computer systems that had been programmed with the collective knowledge of military aviation's greatest tactical minds. Commander Rodriguez, the base operations officer, was studying the timeline display with growing amazement. "She's achieved 4 kills in 17 minutes, while surviving attacks that have eliminated every other pilot who's attempted this challenge in the past 5 years. At this rate of performance, she's not just going to break Commander Morrison's record, she's going to obliterate it." The mathematical reality was becoming impossible to deny. If Raven could maintain her current kill rate while continuing to survive the increasingly desperate attacks from the remaining enemy aircraft, Raven descended from the cockpit with the same composed professionalism she had displayed throughout the morning, removing her helmet and tucking it under her arm while her eyes swept across the assembled crowd. She appeared calm and collected, despite having just completed the most demanding flight of her career. Though those who knew her well could detect the subtle signs of controlled excitement, the slight flush in her cheeks, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands, the heightened alertness that came from sustained adrenaline exposure. Admiral Reynolds reached her first, extending her hand with an expression that balanced official formality with genuine admiration. "Lieutenant Calloway," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent flight line, "what you accomplished today represents a watershed moment in the history of naval aviation. In 35 minutes, you didn't just break a record, you redefined what we thought was possible for a single pilot operating against overwhelming odds." The handshake lasted longer than military protocol typically required, a gesture that conveyed respect between two professionals who understood the significance of what had just occurred. When the Admiral released her grip, she took a half step back and continued her assessment with the measured delivery of someone choosing her words for posterity. "Your tactical innovations during the simulation demonstrated a level of creative thinking that surpassed not only our expectations, but the parameters of our most advanced training systems. The artificial intelligence programming that has challenged our best pilots for over 3 decades was unable to adapt to your unconventional approaches to aerial combat." Captain Blackstone stepped forward, his weathered face showing the strain of a man preparing to eat a substantial portion of crow in front of dozens of witnesses. His voice, typically confident and commanding, carried notes of uncertainty and embarrassment that made his words all the more powerful for their obvious sincerity. "Lieutenant Calloway," he began, pausing to clear his throat before continuing, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond the professional courtesies typically exchanged between military officers. This morning, I allowed my preconceptions and biases to cloud my judgment regarding your capabilities as a combat pilot. The admission created a ripple of surprised murmurs among the assembled personnel. Public apologies from senior officers to junior personnel were rare in military culture, particularly when delivered in front of large audiences. Blackstone's willingness to acknowledge his error represented a level of professional integrity that elevated him in the estimation of many observers, even as it highlighted the magnitude of his initial misjudgment. Your call sign Whisper was earned through demonstrated excellence in stealth operations. He continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. I interpreted that designation as indicating a preference for avoiding direct confrontation, when in reality, it represented a sophisticated understanding of tactical flexibility that allowed you to engage enemy forces on your own terms rather than theirs. He paused again, studying Revan's composed expression before delivering the words that would be quoted in fighter pilot-ready rooms for years to come. Today you proved that the most dangerous pilots aren't necessarily those who fight the loudest or the hardest. They're the ones who fight the smartest. Your performance this morning was a masterclass in tactical innovation that humbled every observer in that control room. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, the Air Force exchange pilot who had contributed to the morning's mockery, approached with obvious reluctance but unmistakable determination to add his own acknowledgement to the growing chorus of recognition. Lieutenant, I've flown combat missions in 4 different theaters of operation, and I've never seen tactical decision-making that approached the level you demonstrated today. Your ability to process multiple threats simultaneously while maintaining offensive initiative redefined my understanding of what single-pilot air combat operations can achieve. The recognition continued as other senior officers stepped forward to offer their assessments and congratulations. Major Thompson, Commander Hayes, and Dr. Chen each contributed their professional perspectives on different aspects of Raven's performance, creating a collective evaluation that painted a picture of achievement that transcended normal measures of pilot proficiency. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, the senior maintenance technician who had prepared her aircraft for the mission. His approach was more hesitant than that of the commissioned officers, reflecting the traditional barriers between enlisted personnel and aviators. But his words carried the weight of decades of experience supporting combat operations. "Mom," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been preparing Navy aircraft for combat missions since before you were born, and I've never been prouder to have my signature on a maintenance logbook. That airplane performed flawlessly today because you flew it the way it was designed to be flown, not just as a machine, but as an extension of your own tactical thinking." The maintenance chief's recognition sparked a wave of applause from the ground crews and support personnel who had gathered around the aircraft. These were men and women who understood better than anyone the difference between competent piloting and genuine excellence, and their spontaneous demonstration of respect carried perhaps more weight than all the official commendations combined. As the formal recognition continued, word of Raven's performance was spreading throughout the naval aviation community with the speed that only truly extraordinary achievements could generate. Secure communication channels between naval air stations were carrying detailed reports of her tactical innovations, while senior commanders at the Pentagon were requesting immediate briefings on the implications of her success for future pilot training and combat doctrine development. The 17 enemy aircraft she had destroyed represented more than just a numerical achievement. They demonstrated tactical approaches that could revolutionize how single-pilot air combat operations were conducted in contested environments. Military strategists were already beginning to analyze her methods for potential integration into advanced training curricula and operational planning procedures, standing on the flight line at Thornfield, surrounded by the recognition and respect of her peers. Raven felt the profound satisfaction that came from achieving a goal that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The call sign whisper would never again be associated with hiding or avoiding confrontation. It would represent the ultimate expression of tactical excellence and innovative thinking under pressure. That evening, as the desert sun painted the Nevada sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Raven found herself alone on the observation deck of the base operations tower. The celebration had continued well into the afternoon, with congratulations from pilots who had traveled from across the country to witness what was already being called the greatest individual performance in air combat simulation history. But now, in the quiet hours after the crowds had dispersed, she finally had the solitude necessary to process what had truly occurred, and why it mattered so deeply to her personally. She reached into the breast pocket of her flight suit and withdrew a small weathered photograph that she had carried with her through every significant moment of her naval career. The image showed a younger version of herself, perhaps 8 years old, standing beside a rusted chain-link fence at a small municipal airport in rural Montana. Behind her, barely visible through the cyclone fencing, sat a collection of aging civilian aircraft that represented the entire aviation industry in her isolated hometown of Cedar Falls. But it wasn't the aircraft in the photograph that mattered. It was the woman standing beside young Raven, her arm draped protectively around her daughter's shoulders while pointing toward something beyond the camera's frame. Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Calloway had been one of the first female Navy pilots to fly combat missions during the early days of women's integration into frontline aviation roles, and her influence on Raven's life had been profound and lasting. Photograph had been taken during one of Sarah's rare visits home from her deployment aboard the USS Independence, during a brief period when mother and daughter had driven out to the airport to watch civilian aircraft practice touch-and-go landings on the small runway. Raven remembered that day with crystalline clarity, the smell of aviation fuel mixing with Montana wildflowers, the sound of small engines echoing off distant mountain peaks, and most importantly, her mother's quiet voice explaining why flying represented the ultimate expression of human freedom and capability. "Baby," Sarah had said while they watched a Cessna 152 execute a perfect landing in the crosswind conditions that made the Cedar Falls Airport notorious among regional pilots. "There's something magical that happens when you're alone in an aircraft, thousands of feet above the ground, making decisions that require every bit of skill and intelligence you possess. In that cockpit, nobody cares about your gender, your background, or their preconceptions about what you should or shouldn't be able to accomplish." Those words had shaped Raven's understanding of aviation as something transcendent, a realm where performance and capability mattered more than social expectations or traditional limitations. Her mother had described flying as the ultimate meritocracy, where physics and aerodynamics didn't discriminate based on anything other than skill, preparation, and determination. But Sarah Calloway's naval career had been cut tragically short just 3 years later, when her FA-18 Hornet had suffered a catastrophic engine failure during a routine training mission off the coast of Southern California. The investigation had revealed a maintenance error that should have been caught during pre-flight inspections, but the mechanical failure had occurred at such low altitude that even her exceptional piloting skills couldn't overcome the laws of physics and gravity. Raven had been 11 years old when the military representatives arrived at their small Montana home to deliver the news that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life. The memory of that moment remained vivid and painful even 15 years later. The formal condolences, the folded flag, the crushing realization that her mother's dreams of blazing trails for future generations of female aviators had been permanently grounded. In the years that followed, Raven had struggled with the question of whether pursuing her own naval aviation career represented a tribute to her mother's memory or a dangerous obsession with following in the footsteps of someone whose journey had ended in tragedy. Her father, overwhelmed by grief, and the practical challenges of raising a daughter alone, had actively discouraged her interest in flying, arguing that aviation was too dangerous for someone who represented his only remaining connection to the woman he had loved. The tension had reached a breaking point during Raven's senior year of high school, when she announced her intention to apply for the Naval Academy and pursue a career in military aviation. Her father's response had been immediate and unambiguous. If she insisted on following what he called her death wish, she would have to do so without his support or blessing. The ultimatum had forced her to choose between family harmony and personal ambition, a decision that had haunted her through every subsequent challenge and achievement. She had chosen aviation, but the cost had been higher than she had anticipated. Her father had followed through on his threat, cutting off all communication and financial support just when she needed it most. The Naval Academy years had been marked by academic excellence and flight training success, but also by profound loneliness and the constant weight of wondering whether her choices were worth the personal sacrifice they had required. The call sign Whisper had been earned during her first operational deployment, when her squadron mates had noticed her ability to slip undetected through enemy radar coverage while conducting reconnaissance missions over hostile territory. But the nickname had deeper meaning for Raven. It represented her mother's quiet voice during those childhood conversations about flying, the gentle guidance that had shaped her understanding of aviation as something noble and transformative. Every challenge she had faced during her naval career had been measured against her mother's legacy and the sacrifices that had made her own opportunities possible. The mockery from senior pilots like Captain Blackstone wasn't just professional skepticism. It was a direct attack on everything her mother had fought to achieve during her own pioneering career in naval aviation. Today, single quotes S performance in the Squadron Elimination Challenge represented more than just personal vindication or professional achievement. It was proof that Sarah Calloway's belief in aviation as the ultimate meritocracy had been correct, that skill and determination could overcome prejudice and preconception when given the opportunity to demonstrate themselves under objective conditions. 17 enemy aircraft she had destroyed weren't just targets in a computer simulation. They were validation of her mother's conviction that excellence in aviation transcended traditional limitations and social barriers. Each successful engagement had been powered by years of preparation, dedication, and the unwavering belief that her mother's dreams could be achieved by the next generation of pilots, willing to pay the necessary price. As she sat on the observation deck, watching the last traces of sunlight fade behind the distant mountains, Raven felt a profound sense of connection to something larger than her individual achievement. The photograph in her hands represented not just personal history, but the continuation of a legacy that had begun with pioneering female aviators who had fought for the right to serve their country in combat roles. Tomorrow, she would report to Project Valkyrie and begin the next phase of her naval career, carrying with her the knowledge that she had honored her mother's memory in the most meaningful way possible. The call sign Whisper would be remembered not as the quiet voice of someone avoiding confrontation, but as the legacy of a pilot who had proven that excellence speaks louder than any doubt or discrimination. The stars were beginning to appear. In the darkening sky above Nevada, the same stars that had guided aviators for generations. Somewhere among them, Raven believed her mother was watching and finally able to see that her sacrifice had not been in vain. 6 months later, Lieutenant Commander Raven Whisper Calloway stood before the assembled faculty and student body of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the annual Symposium on Tactical Innovation in Modern Warfare. The promotion to lieutenant commander had been expedited following her record-breaking performance at Thornfield, and her assignment to Project Valkyrie had opened doors to opportunities that most officers spent entire careers pursuing. The auditorium was filled to capacity with some of the brightest minds in military strategy, aerospace engineering, and tactical development. Flag officers, defense contractors, international military attaches, and advanced degree candidates had gathered to hear her discuss the tactical methodologies that had revolutionized single-pilot air combat doctrine and influenced training programs throughout the global military aviation community. But perhaps the most significant change wasn't visible in her new rank insignia or prestigious assignment. It was the transformation in how others perceived and interacted with her. The call sign whisper was no longer whispered with skepticism or amusement, but spoken with the reverence typically reserved for legendary figures in military aviation history. Her tactical innovations had been incorporated into the curricula of every major flight training program in the Western world, and her name appeared alongside aviation pioneers like Chuck Yeager and Robin Olds in contemporary discussions of transformational military aviators. The audience fell silent as she approached the podium, her dress blue uniform bearing the ribbons and decorations that marked her as one of the Navy's most accomplished young officers. The Distinguished Flying Cross, Navy Achievement Medal, and National Defense Service Medal represented just the formal recognition of achievements that had redefined what was possible in aerial combat operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from knowing her words would be analyzed and quoted by military theorists for years to come. "6 months ago, I stood in a hangar at Thornfield Naval Air Station as the most junior pilot participating in the Squadron Elimination Challenge. I was surrounded by officers with decades more experience, superior rank, and combat records that I could only aspire to match." She paused, allowing her eyes to sweep across the assembled audience before continuing with the measured delivery of someone who had learned to communicate complex tactical concepts to diverse audiences. What occurred that day represented more than just an individual achievement or the breaking of a long-standing record. It demonstrated that innovation in military tactics emerges not from adherence to established doctrine, but from the willingness to question fundamental assumptions about what is possible when conventional wisdom meets creative thinking under extreme pressure. The Project Valkyrie assignment had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. The classified program involved developing next-generation air combat tactics for advanced stealth aircraft, integrating artificial intelligence with human decision-making capabilities, and training elite pilots for missions that push the boundaries of what individual aircrew could accomplish in contested environments. Her role as lead tactical development officer had allowed her to influence the evolution of military aviation doctrine at the highest levels of strategic planning. The tactical approaches that proved successful during my simulation weren't developed in a classroom or laboratory, she continued, drawing on her prepared remarks while maintaining eye contact with key figures in the audience. They emerged from the recognition that artificial intelligence systems, regardless of their sophistication, operate within predictable parameters that can be exploited by human creativity and adaptive thinking. The standing ovation that interrupted her presentation lasted nearly 2 minutes, led by Admiral Reynolds, who had traveled from Washington specifically to attend Raven's address. The applause represented more than polite appreciation for her remarks. It was acknowledgement from the military's senior leadership that her contributions to tactical development had fundamentally altered how they approached air combat operations in the modern era. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come 3 weeks earlier, when she had received an unexpected telephone call from Montana. Her father's voice, aged and uncertain, after 6 years of silence, had carried across the distance between them with words that healed wounds she had almost forgotten existed. "Raven," he had said, his voice breaking with emotion that he had suppressed for too long, "I saw the news coverage of your speech at the Pentagon. Your mother would have been so proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm ashamed that it took me this long to tell you that I'm proud too." The reconciliation had been tentative but genuine, built on his gradual understanding that her choice to pursue naval aviation hadn't been a rejection of family, but rather a fulfillment of dreams that transcended individual sacrifice. The newspaper clippings he had been secretly collecting since her Naval Academy graduation demonstrated that his anger had been motivated by fear rather than genuine disapproval, and his willingness to acknowledge his mistake had opened the possibility of rebuilding their relationship. The tactical revolution that began at Thornfield had ripple effects throughout the international military community. Defense contractors were incorporating her methodologies into advanced flight training simulators, while Allied nations were sending their most promising pilots to study the tactical approaches that had made single-pilot operations against overwhelming odds not just possible, but demonstrably effective. The Naval Aviation Hall of Honor had installed a permanent exhibit dedicated to her achievements, featuring the helmet she had worn during the record-breaking flight, alongside detailed analysis of the tactical innovations that had redefined air combat doctrine. Visitors to the Pentagon display included military officers from around the world, aerospace engineering students, and young people considering careers in naval aviation who saw in her story proof that excellence could overcome any barrier or preconception. The lesson from that day at Thornfield, she continued, building toward the conclusion of her address, is that the most dangerous limitation we face isn't technological or doctrinal. It's the assumption that what hasn't been done before cannot be done at all. Innovation requires the courage to attempt what others consider impossible, and the persistence to continue even when conventional wisdom suggests failure is inevitable. The applause that followed was immediate and sustained, but Raven's attention was drawn to a young woman in the front row wearing the uniform of a Naval Academy midshipman. The cadet's expression combined inspiration with determination, the same look that Raven remembered seeing in mirrors during her own academy years when she had dreamed of achieving exactly what she had accomplished. After the formal presentation concluded, the midshipman approached with the nervous energy of someone meeting a personal hero. "Ma'am," she said, her voice steady despite obvious excitement, "I'm Midshipman Jennifer Martinez, and I wanted to thank you for proving that call signs like Whisper can be earned through excellence rather than stereotype." The comment crystallized everything that Raven's achievement had come to represent. Her success hadn't just broken a simulation record or earned personal recognition. It had demonstrated to future generations of aviators that excellence transcended traditional limitations and that tactical innovation could emerge from the most unexpected sources. "Midshipman Martinez," Raven replied, extending her hand with the same gesture that Admiral Reynolds had offered to her 6 months earlier. "Remember that the most important battles aren't fought against enemy aircraft or computer simulations. They're fought against the assumptions that tell us what we cannot achieve. Your job is to prove those assumptions wrong, one flight at a time." As she walked away from the Naval War College that evening, Raven reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small Montana airport to the pinnacle of naval aviation achievement. The photograph of her mother remained in her wallet, but it no longer represented unfulfilled dreams or tragic sacrifice. It had become a symbol of continuity, proof that the legacy of pioneering aviators could be carried forward by each new generation willing to push beyond the boundaries of what others considered possible. The call sign Whisper would echo through the halls of military aviation for decades to come, not as a quiet voice avoiding confrontation, but as a reminder that true tactical innovation emerges when courage meets opportunity in the limitless arena of the sky. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.